If you're looking for a premium 35mm f1.2 for your full-frame camera, either that's Sony or Nikon, the Viltrox Lab 35mm f1.2 is an exceptional lens and it should be at the top of your list because for the price it's sold at, this is by far the best premium bang for your buck lens that I've ever tried. Welcome back, this is Luca, and if you wanted a quick summary on the Viltrox 35mm f1.2, well, now you have it. You can turn this video off, go purchase the lens, and you're gonna be super happy with it. But if you wanna know more, just stick around for 10 minutes or so, and we're gonna talk about this lens a little bit more in depth. Thanks to RCE Photo, the biggest used photographic market in Italy with also several shops around Europe, I was able to try the Viltrox 35mm f1.2 Lab for a couple of weeks, and I was overly impressed with what I got with that lens. This will not be a super technical review. We're not going to dive into corner sharpness, pixel peeping. This lens was launched almost a year ago. There's plenty of those reviews around. I'm sure you've watched each one of those. What this video is going to be is my experience throughout these 2 weeks of shooting it a lot, because I used it a lot, in different scenarios, from more professional type of scenario to more pedestrian type of scenarios. And I want to start with what this lens is designed for, meaning high-end professional shooting, editorial, portrait, studio photography. My experience with this lens has been phenomenal. In this context, this lens has basically no flaws. The lens delivered big time when it comes to image quality, but not only that, it delivered big time in every possible aspect. The sharpness is great even when wide open, even on a 60 megapixel sensor like my A7R5. And while I don't care about sharpness in the corners at f1.2, this lens is really good at it as well. Using this lens a lot, I couldn't find any visible flaw with this lens. Chromatic aberrations are very well controlled to the point where they're basically negligible. Bokeh is visible at times, but it's not that bad. Really nothing that I would be concerned about. The bokeh is just beautiful despite the lens being very sharp. And icing on top of the cake, the autofocus is incredibly reliable. And I'll be honest with you, while shooting with this lens, I have never had the feeling that I was shooting with a third-party lens. I have never felt the difference with Sony GM lenses or even Sigma top-of-the-line lenses. This lens was doing everything I needed for, even from an autofocus perspective, and it never felt like a third-party lens. From a company that entered the autofocusing lens market only 4 years ago, I guess, this is a huge achievement because usually companies take forever to figure out a good way of having their lenses autofocusing well. Realistically, I had a super high hit rate with this lens, very close to 100%. Most of the time when I missed it was because I was moving the autofocusing box where I shouldn't have. So it was basically never the lens's fault. On both my A7 V and my 7R5, I was blown away by the performance of this lens. Even from a video perspective, the lens performs really well. The autofocus tracks incredibly well. The focus bleeding is visible at times, but it's never distracting, so it's something I wouldn't be worried about at all. And for a lens that gets sold MSRP at less than $1,000, but often when Viltrox runs their discount, it gets sold at around $800, if not less. There is nothing in the available market that comes even close to this. The only 35mm f1.2 in the Sony ecosystem that challenges this lens is the Sigma, but the Sigma gets sold at basically between 500 and double the price over the Viltrox Lab f1.2, while the Sony GM gets sold at $1,500, at $1,400, and it's only f1.4, although that only is really between quotes because f1.4 could be enough for the vast majority of people. Realistically, the only downside for professional use with this lens is the fact that with any Sony camera that goes beyond 15 frames per second, Sony puts a limitation to all third-party lenses where you cannot get past that. So even if your camera goes at 30 FPS, like my Sony a7 IV does, I cannot shoot at 30 FPS because Sony limits third-party at just 15 frames per second. Now, for the type of lens that this is, again, studio, portraits, stuff like that, events, weddings, I don't think this is a huge limitation for this specific lens. Of course, if we were talking about wildlife sport photography and stuff like that, it would be a much bigger limitation. But for professional use in this specific case, I wouldn't mind too much about that, especially because you're paying it basically half the price of the Sony version of this lens. Although, if you know you need that quickness, this lens, of course, is not going to be for you like any third-party lens available in the market right now. But on the other hand, a lens being this affordable for what it is, because again, we're talking about the 35mm f1.2, this can also be purchased by non-professional, by enthusiasts, by any photographer that is willing to experiment with a wide aperture lens, and it's not going to spend a lot of money on Sony or Nikon or whatever lens that costs a lot more. And again, at around $800, $900, any enthusiast can give it a shot and try to experiment something like this. And even in the use of for non-professional scenarios, this lens delivers big time. Even if you're shooting your pets or you're doing street photography, if you're using it for landscapes or as your only lens when you're going around, this lens will deliver big time because again, it's got great sharpness, very good bokeh, very good resistance to flare, very good control of chromatic aberration. There is really nothing that you should be worried about when looking at this lens. And again, for the price, even if you're not a professional, you can decide that you want to throw $800, $900 at a lens like this just to have that different look that more pedestrian lenses cannot give you. Now, granted, this lens is big and heavy. It's not the easiest to carry around, and compared to the Sony 35mm f1.8, it basically dwarfs it. But even compared to the 24mm f1.4, which basically is the same size as the 35mm f1.4 GM from Sony, the difference in size and weight is pretty substantial. On cameras such as the a7 V, the a7R5, the more professional bodies, this lens balances relatively well, and the room between the lens barrel and the camera grip is just enough for my fingers to go in it without touching the barrel of the lens. On smaller cameras, when it comes to something like the A7C series or the ZV-E1, something like that, this lens would definitely feel a lot more front heavy and a lot more complicated to handle just because it weighs a lot more than the camera itself. Those dimensions and weights should not be a big issue when it comes to professional use. All the professional lenses tend to be relatively big and heavy, so that shouldn't be an issue for professionals, and it wasn't an issue for me while using it on those professional scenarios that I showed you before. Of course, if we're talking about an enthusiast buying this lens, not for professional use, but just to have fun with it, keep in mind the lens is almost 1 kilogram, if not a little bit more, and it's relatively big. So it's not going to be the easiest to carry around. So it's going to depend a lot on what you want to do with your lenses, what you want to do with your camera. And so in conclusion, this lens is just amazing, but I have a complaint with it. And that complaint, like basically everyone else on this planet is the way they implemented the aperture ring. Because this lens has an aperture ring, but it's different from your normal aperture ring. It's an endless spinning aperture ring that moves you between f1.2 and f16 and then the automatic mode, but there's no stop, there's no hard stops, and it's not clicky enough where you can be sure that if you're clicking one click, it's just 1/3 of a stop. It's a little bit random at times, and without looking at the f-stop on your camera viewfinder or on the lens LCD screen, you will never be sure that you are at the right f-stop that you wanted to use it at. Not only that, it is very easy to move around, so you start with the right one and then you find yourself with a much closed aperture because you just accidentally moved it back and forth. While I don't mind the fact that you can read the aperture on the screen, and I don't mind that the screen on the lens gives you some information like focusing distance and other information that may be useful, I don't think that is a selling point for me. At least I don't care. If it's there, fine, but if it's not there, I wouldn't mind at all. But the biggest issue with the aperture ring is that they went a little bit too far they over-engineered it to the point where it's detrimental to the use of the lens. I would much prefer them to go back to what they're doing with their Pro line. That is exactly the way it should work because it's predictable, it's got hard stops, and you know exactly where you are at all times. That is not a deal breaker to me. Of course, it's not, because the lens is so good and so affordable for what it is that you are going to give it a pass on that. But I really hope that from now on, all the lab lenses go back a little bit. They can keep the screen, but at least give us a normal aperture ring, because it changes a lot the way you can use the camera, the way you can trust your setup. But besides the aperture ring, this lens, as I mentioned, is just fantastic. There's no other way to describe it. Optically great, great bokeh, incredible autofocus, incredible price, and overall incredible performance. And it doesn't make any sense for the price this is sold at. And while in Sony you have some alternatives that you may be willing to consider, if you're talking about a Nikon setup, there is no other alternative to this lens than the Nikon's own 35mm f1.2 plano. That lens is bigger, I believe heavier, and it costs 3 times as much, if not more. This lens makes perfect sense and it's incredible for Sony users. This is a no-brainer for Nikon users. There's really nothing that competes with this lens in the Nikon ecosystem. It's just too good to be true. I hope you liked this video. That is it for today. As usual, ciao, grazie, and I'll see you in the next one.